in early stage of the company, take all the feedback you can. All feedback is valuable, but you almost want to try and draw the circle between who's talking to me because of my network and who's talking to me because I'm solving a problem that they urgently have.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Randall. Welcome to the second episode of the Go-to-Market Lab. For all of you listeners, I think you know this, but just to remind you, this is a podcast really dedicated to helping all of us who are in different stages of SaaS software businesses really understand the art of scaling through our go-to-market strategies, through different pivots and stages of our company. So this is a purpose-built podcast to share all the goodness and all the tips and tricks around go-to-market for founders and for revenue-generating leaders. Today, for the topic, we are going to talk about what really is an ideal customer profile. And bluntly, is your ideal customer profile or your ICP setting you up for success or for failure? And the reason why this came up as a brainstorm, talking to a couple of my friends and colleagues here, was that after working with numerous software companies and over the years, it's really become very, very apparent to me that the fundamental requirement of being at a SaaS company, whether you're doing a market pivot that looks like taking a new module or a new product, if you will, to sell to your existing customer base, or selling that product set to, let's say, a new market, maybe to a government sector that you've never sold before. Those are all things that start to align itself around an ideal customer profile at its core. So before even getting to those market pivots, there's a fundamental question around what is the ideal customer profile. And that's thought through, but it seems like it's something that gets turned squishy and maybe also doesn't start to, for lack of better words, guide the process of the go-to-market afterwards. So nevertheless, what I thought for today's episode, I wanted to bring on an expert to help us think through that. So today I have Emily Shipman. Emily Shipman not only is a dear friend of mine, but I tell everybody that, and Emily, I said this in the last episode, by the way, as a teaser, that at some point in the very near future, you'll be on Fortune magazine as in the top 10 most powerful women in the world. So she has spent her career from a product strategy perspective in all different types of capacities. And currently, she's the vice president at MasterCard for the cybersecurity portfolio. So, Emily, can you just give our listeners just a little bit more background as to you and where you've come from in the space? Because in my opinion, I think your background and how you got to the place you are actually is what lends to your superpower, because you've got very, very different lenses in terms of how you work with your companies and do your job.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one that I love. It's near and dear to my heart. And I think it's so important, especially in the success of scaling products. A little bit of my background, I spent my entire career working in enterprise security products in the cybersecurity space. Through B2B sales. And I've really mostly had the opportunity to work on and love the scale stage of products. So I spent 10 years at a company scaling a product from 40 million to 300 million, said that was fun, let's do it again, went back to a Series A startup, enjoyed that experience. And now my role at MasterCard as their vice president of their cyber portfolio is really to take a lot of products that come in through acquisitions that are usually on the smaller size, kind of Series A, Series B size companies, and then scale them up to MasterCard size products as part of our enterprise portfolio. I came into products very kind of a zigzag path. I started my career as an engineer. I realized I really enjoy the human side of problem solving and figuring out what makes people tick and what motivates them, and ended up working in technical sales as a result, which I think ties really tightly to understanding your ICP and figuring that out. And then ultimately moved into product and started falling in love with figuring out solutions for customers at a bigger scale through product creation.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you clarified that, because I think most people, when they hear the MasterCard brand, they're not thinking about really, in your capacity, almost acting as a VC or PE and incubating companies as they kind of, or, kind of a Y accelerator, if you will, Y combinator. So I'm glad that you clarified that. So let's kind of kick this off let's just start with the very basics. And let's debunk any different definitions that our listeners might have as to really, truly, what does good look like for an ideal customer profile? So maybe, Emily, if you could for you, what is an ICP and how would you describe that?
So the way that I look at it personally has a couple hallmarks. I identify an ICP as the archetype of customers that you can repeatedly delight with the product you're building and selling. And there's a couple components that I look for with my teams as we identify our ICPs. One, you need to find that archetype who urgently feels the pain that you are solving. Two, they need to have the desire and means to procure a solution to that problem, which parentheses means the budget to solve it. And then three, your ICP has to be a person for whom you have a uniquely differentiated solution. And I think the solution part, the solution alignment, is something people sometimes forget when they look at ICPs. It's not really just a question of a good market. It's a market your product works for. And those things have to come together in an ICP. I think one of the things that it's not is really important to be aware of. It's not everyone you sell to. So when I first talk to teams about ICPs, sometimes they say, oh yeah, but we do have a couple customers like this. And we have a couple customers like that, a couple customers like that. And they want to build this broad view that is everyone they sell to. You can sell to customers outside your ICP. That's fine. It's not like you're not going to take your money, but your ICP is who you have in your head, who you prioritize for when you make decisions on marketing or product or when you train your sales rep. It's not the be all and end all, but it's what you're optimizing for. Who you're optimizing for, that is your ICP.
That's interesting how you describe that because, just to tell a little story from the past, I was at a company, working with a company that they were, from day one, Emily, they were very clear on their ICP. It's an enterprise company. It's in this industry. This is our target buyer. Here's the influencer, yada, yada, yada. And then peel back the layers as I was specifically working with them on pipeline generation. I think opposite, different than what you're saying. Majority of their pipeline really looked like SMB to mid-market. And it's just kind of fascinating. It's like, I'm a little bit confused. Like, why is it that this is what you're selling to, who you're actually selling to in reality versus what was declared from the rooftops as to, who we're going after? Curious if you've kind of seen that before and what you think might be, for lack of better words, the root cause of what could be going on there.
Yeah, there's a couple things that can cause that. Some of them are problematic and some of them aren't. Sometimes organizations are a little delusional about who their ICP is. And I think that happens most often when people say large enterprise and they're not a large enterprise product. That's a good example when I say your product has to fit your ICP. There's something so sexy about the deal size that you can get, the logo names from large enterprise, and everybody wants to chase that. Not every product is a good fit for large enterprise. Not every market has the availability, the white space to support selling into that. So I think it's very common for people to say, we're going after the whales because that's where the market opportunity is. If your product doesn't align to that, that's not really your ICP. It's your goal. Now, I said it can be problematic and it cannot. It's problematic if you aren't aware of realizing that those two things disconnect. So if you just keep running down that path and saying our current sale base doesn't match our ICP and you're not conscious of it and aware of it, that's a huge problem. Now, sometimes you say, we're getting traction in this market like SMBs where we can get space. But ultimately, our goal is to pivot long-term strategically into the enterprise. Well, that's a case where your ICP doesn't match your current run rate revenue, but you know that and you're okay with that. And you know that your ICP is aspirational. So I think you have to ask yourself, you have to really objectively ask yourself, is this ICP aspirational? It doesn't match our current. And if so, we know there's a disconnect. But if you can't make that jump in a year or two, then you got to reassess.
Yeah. Do you feel like, so when you're going about creating, or I'd say coming to a conclusion on an ICP, just tactically, Emily, who, in terms of title or remit, who at an organization is running that or kind of responsible for that, and who needs to be participating in that conversation?
Yeah. I would say all of the ICP workshops that I run with my team, it's usually a very cross-functional exercise of the executive team of the business, a handful of your top performers in customer-facing functions. So sales engineering, customer success. And then I also like to pull in a couple people who, regardless of what their role is in the business, have experience being your ICP. They came from that job. So if you're selling to cybersecurity, in my case, you're selling to cybersecurity professionals, pull in your cybersecurity team, pull in one or two people from that function. Now, if you find yourself saying, well, we don't have anyone in our business who came from our ICP. We're selling to banks and we don't have anyone who came from a banking background. Stop what you're doing and go recruit someone with that background, because you're going to miss the mark. I think it's really, really important in defining your ICP to have people who have lived and are deeply empathetic with the experience of your customers in some way. Beyond that, though, I think probably the core of your question was, who are the typical stakeholders? It especially really needs to be a joint combination of product, marketing, and sales coming together and all being in agreement. Because ultimately, your ICP is going to be who you design for, who you market to, and who you sell to. So everybody's got to be in lockstep on it.
Right. And obviously that can maybe change. And to your point, it might kind of augment throughout the years, but there has to be a thesis, or else everybody is maybe following a different shiny star. So that makes perfect sense. I'm kind of curious, and you can hide the names to protect the innocent, but can you share any stories with us, Emily, of like, wow, this company really, the way that they approached defining their ICP, or the way that maybe pivoted their ICP, they just did a phenomenal job to inspire our listeners today?
The case in my career that I think was the best ICP experience was early stage startup that I joined. And they'd kind of been flatlining a little bit, is how I put it. They'd been at the same revenue level for a few years, and they didn't have an ICP defined at all. And you could tell that there were a mix of customers that they had, some of whom were really loud, but were not happy. They kept voicing ideas for the product. It was like they were never satisfied. And then they had another segment of customers who weren't as loud, but used the product and renewed and would speak at events and stuff like that. And at first, their roadmap was really just oriented towards the squeaky wheels. And I think that is a mistake that a lot of companies, especially early stage companies, make, is that they hear the feedback from the loud people, but don't necessarily look at who are we actually delighting and how do we do more of that? How do we make repeatable versions of that? So what we did was we looked closely at usage data. And I really do believe that usage data is an underutilized component of ICP definition. Because when we started to look at the types of customers that we were going to interview, we went and took a segment of who is actually using this thing frequently as an indicator of value. And we interestingly found that some of the loudest executive sponsors were giving us ideas on the product were almost never logging in. They were just really opinionated people. That's the way I can put it. So when we started to kind of go after the like more silent, but people who were actually getting value and finding patterns in them, in the size of company they were at, what motivated their purchase, what problems they were solving for, we were able to find really, really clear patterns, and they were a total pivot away from the roadmap that we had before. So before, we were large enterprise, kind of CISO driven, people who wanted tons of configuration and all these really, really advanced features, and nothing we built was ever good enough. And then we found this really happy segment of the market that was a total opposite end, like newly developing companies who, in their case, were hiring their first security executive. They were coming into a new team, trying to start from ground up. It was a very clear archetype, like a very clear pattern that we could get. And I don't think we would have found it if we had just done a market-based analysis or we had just talked to our loudest customers. We found a great ICP and made a great pivot by getting to the people who are using the product and then just going and finding more of that person.
And that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's a very common scenario. Why is that? Because in your early stage, your pre-seed, or let's say kind of series A lot of times you're getting to your customers because you have a network introduction through one of your board members, et cetera. And who's going to say no to, the biggest retailer in the world or whoever it might be. And then you find kind of when you're getting into it, holy man, they don't really, they're using us as a custom software development shop, right? So Then we kind of have to take a step back and kind of understand where is it that we go to. And, as a former seller and sales leader, I can say it's really hard to say no. And I think this is where, as a shameless plug for our next session that we're going to talk about, the demo and technical qualification, I think it's really important to make sure that the sales team understands and communicates when they feel like they want to pursue a deal that does not have a good technical fit. Because in those cases in the early stage, it could, to your point, in the situation that I saw, it can almost capsize the company in terms of all the special needs they had to have for this one organization. So I'm glad that you shared that story. Emily, so let's kind of take it to you. So I'm a founder coming to you and you're my board advisor. I'm kind of asking for advice. To your point, I'm in the stage where we've got some design partners that have maybe different types of personas. And so we don't really have mass numbers. We've got 5 customers, but we're starting to think about our plan for fundraising. So really need to get clarity on our ICP. Can you give me kind of and you started to do this with your usage examples, but kind of walk through kind of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 for our listeners as to, simplifying how are you going to go about this process?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think when you're soliciting reactions, feedback on your product idea early on or your business idea early on, be as wide as you can in the group of people that you solicit feedback from. Don't just start with what the ideal ICP is in your head. You want to cast a little bit wider of a net than you think you should and be very experimental. Just pay attention to who is returning your emails, who is returning your calls, who is interested in talking to you. The people who are willing to give you their time is the first indicator of an ICP, and really closely kind of look at patterns of those people. And what makes them stand out, and ask them, like flat out ask them, why did you even bother talking to me today? If the answer is, I like you as a person, then, or some version of that, or so-and-so connected me with you and I really, I trust their opinion, then you have to sort of lower that person's feedback a little bit in your mental weighting of how much they thank your ICP, because they're speaking out of a sense of a personal relationship. What you want to keep looking for is going to find those people who say, oh man, I heard about what you're doing and I have this problem and I'm so excited to talk about someone who's working on solving it. Those people, if you have that sort of mental rubric of how much you're weighting feedback, those people are golden. And that's should be driving what you're thinking about. So you really kind of in early stage of the company, take all the feedback you can. All feedback is valuable, but you almost want to try and draw the circle between who's talking to me because of my network and who's talking to me because I'm solving a problem that they urgently have. So then I would say the other thing you're looking at beyond that is who's willing to give deeper commitments. So I really stress when I'm looking for design partners, not just jump on a call for an hour themselves, but who's willing to give me their team's time, who's willing to actually log in and test out a prototype, who's willing to make kind of commitments of value, things that are dear for them. And then this sounds kind of obvious, but who's willing to spend money? If you have a design partner that you engage for a year and they're happy to give feedback left and right, but at the end of the day, you can't get them to ever make any kind of monetary commitment to buying your product, at a certain point, you've got to let them go and move on and keep looking
Sure.
for the people who will make some kind of commitment. Because again, your ICP is someone who has the problem and also has the power and willingness to pay for it.
Yes.
And sometimes we see that, like in cybersecurity products, we see that a lot, where you have people who are interested in a solution, but their boss who makes the buying decision is never going to prioritize buying that solution. So you can enhance and enhance and enhance all day long for that individual contributor who wants all these things. But if they don't have the buying power and they can't convince their boss to have the buying power, then ultimately that's not going to be your ICP. So those are some of the things I look for. Being honest with yourself and separating out kind of personal relationships, who's committing time, who's committing value, and who's committing money ultimately, and constantly reevaluating against those criteria and being comfortable letting people go as design partners when they're not checking the boxes.
Yeah, I just want to punctuate something that you just said to what our earlier question was around the definition of an ICP, because one of the pieces you really stressed was one of those three components of them is budget. And so I just want to highlight, to me, what I heard in your story just now was that many a times you're working with the user, for lack of a better word, for the person who is going to be kind of in the product day to day, but they're not going to be the buyer. So ultimately, if you're not able to articulate the value add that the organization has, and that's not an expensive enough problem for someone to commit dollars to, then there's another question, right? Working with an organization to where the thesis is of the user, not only is that user not the buyer, but the buyer ultimately is actually another department just because of the nature of the product, which complicates the sale even more, right? Of somebody else who really is kind of the authority, but not who's going to be the end all, the person who's going to benefit from it. And I think that's really important because I find, Emily, I wonder if this has kind of come across your desk as well. I find that in working with companies that are a little bit later, so I think this is kind of the thesis that happens. It's not uncommon that your startup is going to say, hey, my ICP is going to be in Fortune 1000 or, as an enterprise organization. But obviously, it's much easier to get to mid-market companies. And so you start doing deals and you realize that deal size is not going to actually get you to the level of the goals that you originally hypothesized whenever you had the enterprise ICP. And so then you start to, kind of shift and understand what that, and try to think about how do you move to that market. But then the reality is that that's not, and then you're kind of re-architecting the product to meet enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think one of the fundamental pieces that to get to the third point that you had about the ICP definition, not only budget, but making sure that the ICP, there is a product market fit in that, because doing that later and trying to reverse engineer that is very hard. And ultimately you're going to, kind of miss something or have to retool that. So kind of curious if you've seen those types of issues come through.
Yeah, actually, as you were talking through that, it made me think of maybe another follow-up to your early question of what mistakes have I seen people make, or what do I see people do wrong? Or if I were advising a new startup, what do I guide them? Market and ICP are not the same thing. When I talk about my definition of ICP, you'll notice I say things like it's an archetype. It is a characteristic of a person or a group of people. That is an ICP. And I think people often make the mistake of looking at markets. And markets, in my opinion, are way too broad of a focus because it's very hard to look at a market and really get to a specific problem that people feel urgently. It's hard to market and talk about user versus buyer. When I think about an ICP, I think about you don't really have a good ICP until there is an actual face of an actual human that comes to your mind when you think about it. If you don't have actual names and faces in your mind of those top 5 customers who reflect your ICP that you talk to frequently, you text them on a weekly basis, you have not found your ICP yet. your ICP is not a market. It is much more personal in a sense than a market, because markets don't have problems. Humans have problems. Markets don't make buying decisions. Humans make buying decisions. So I think when people say we're focusing on mid-enterprise, like mid-size healthcare institutions, that's not an ICP. An ICP is a newly appointed chief information security officer at a mid-size healthcare institution who is struggling with a disorganized team and a need to report to their board on the posture of their enterprise. That is an ICP. Like, there are human beings you can think of that hopefully match that criteria, if that's your business line. And I think that's one of the things that is so often forgot about, because the reason that's important is when you look at an ICP as a person, you know what people will respond to in a marketing message. You know what people will value in a product. It's hard to anticipate how a market's going to respond to a marketing message, how a market's going to respond to a feature in a product. So when you look at it at that human level, you really help everyone in your business organize, create that sense of empathy. It would probably freak some of my customers out to know this. I think these guys would appreciate it. But the last startup I worked at, we had ICP slides, and I had the LinkedIn profile pictures of Phil Beyer from Etsy and Ryan Black, like the CISOs from some of our customers. Their LinkedIn pictures were on our product slides that my team would use internally. And we would talk about them all the time and say, how would Phil feel about this feature? How are we building this for Phil? And we were so much better because there was a human behind the things we were doing, not just how would a small enterprise feel about this. It's a difference, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. That reminds me, a long time ago, I read a book called Made to Stick, and it actually talks about that. I think the example that they give is they're building one of those mega churches, and they came up with John and Lucia. Here's the couple's names. This is what they do for a living. And so they had this persona, this family, so that everybody at the organization could be crystal clear as they were putting together services and they're doing their jobs as to who they're trying to delight, so to speak. So I like that. I've never thought about, almost just, that could be like a big head. You could get those big heads, put them around the office. That would be cool. And I think one of the things that maybe just to draw this to a bit of a revenue lens or a sales lens, what I think the biggest advantage of that as you start to convert into what is really the messaging on the website, what is the pitch deck, what does the demo need to say, is with that level of specificity and clarity, it is a lot easier to get it right on the sales side. It's a lot easier to train the sales team if you can walk through and have them meet, the Phil and the John, and really get them to visualize. And then now you're not talking about these amorphous statements that all the vendors have as these unique differentiators. From your perspective, are there any other maybe gotchas, or these are kind of where some people might not intentionally, but inadvertently go wrong at, let's say, a later stage? So maybe kind of series B, C, D. So established market, established set of customers, and perhaps they are doing a pivot of some sort, and hence they're kind of retooling or maybe expanding their ICP. Can you talk about any kind of war stories you have around those scenarios?
Ooh, so it feels really natural as companies scale to say we need to expand to multiple ICPs. And I think that's very logical for people to say, hey, we want to grow in revenue. We want to grow in our footprint. We need more products to sell to more people. So we're just going to have a couple other ICPs and solve problems for those customers. The big mistake that I've seen companies make, and this is like in the $1 to $200 million range is kind of where I invest, is that your existing sales force is probably really optimized for your existing ICP.
Yes.
And if you are going to make an ICP pivot, you need to have a very serious conversation with yourself on, is your existing sales force going to be able to get to that new ICP? So you've got this hopefully at that point, you've got this cast of great reps with contacts and relationships, and they're firing on all cylinders and they're fantastic sales reps, but they may not have the network of people in your new ICP.
Right.
And so when you add that one in, you're just taking their value and your experience and kind of not utilizing it as much. I worked at a product that was around that size and largely sold to like auditors and security people. And it was around the time that the governance, that all the European data privacy regulations were coming out. There was this big flurry in the compliance industry.
Right.
And the company I was working for said, oh, let's start creating privacy products. It'll be great. This is a great market. And they built a product for it. And then they just handed it to their existing sales team and said, go sell it. And it just absolutely fell flat on its face because they didn't realize that the privacy departments at companies is just a completely different group of people than they had ever seen before. Like they had sold to technologists and now they were selling to lawyers. Selling to security people and selling to lawyers is just about as far end of the spectrum as you can get.
Very different market type, to use your word.
Very, very different. And their sales team just didn't know how to, their sales engineers didn't know how to demo to that audience. They were way too technical. Meanwhile, other products doing basically the same thing in the same space took off and grew really fast. And now some of those are billion-dollar companies. So the market was there, the product fit was good, but I was part of it at the time, where we failed specifically was realizing that our sales team wasn't going to be ready to make that gap to the new ICP. So I think anytime you're making an ICP pivot, you really, really need to look at your sales team and ask yourself, is it the same sales team that's going to do this? Do we need to add specialists? Do we need to retool? Because it is a hard jump to make.
Yeah, that's actually in our last episode with Julian Waits. One of the things that we are talking about with go-to-market is how when there's a pivot, it's very common that you say, all right, here's a data sheet. Good luck, sales. And that's their quote unquote go-to-market launch, versus the whole shebang of really, again, thinking through the ICP, validating it. Do we need to do enablement? What type of enablement do we need to do? How are we going to retool the messaging? What's going to be the route to market to get to that archetype if it's not the same archetype that we're selling to, and really thinking through that process? Because I think, to your point, the tail that wags the dog can't be, okay, sales team, go get this person, right? I think the more dramatic story that I would share that you made me think of, Emily, is, enterprise software company. And then the hypothesis was, let's go mid-market. Again, entirely set up as a team to do field sales, right? Field sell, people in the field, creating relationships with a Rolodex, and with a mid-market sale, the size of the sale that needed to be almost 80%, 90% demand gen is all from inbound, right? Marketing engine was not set up that way. And so ultimately, this organization decided not to go down that path because the investment and that infrastructure just was, didn't make any sense for what the gains that we're going to get from that additional revenue in order to create that muscle. And I think, or vice versa. So I'm working with an organization now where they are government focused, public sector focused, and they want to go to private sector, to, kind of normal, for-profit organizations. And really thinking about, we're having conversations around, what does that team need to look like? What is the type of experience of the reps that you need to have? Are they the right people? That conversation sounds very different. And so, that's the question. Are you ready for that talent management shift? Can you afford to do that for the organization? Because also your talent, it might not just be a case of enablement. In some cases, you might actually have to hire different sets of people with a different price point, with a different set of experiences, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say, and I think most of the time people assume it is an enablement thing, and most of the time it is not an enablement thing. Most of the time there's going to be, if you really are making an ICP shift, brace yourself for a heavy marketing spend, brace yourself for having maybe a dedicated sales team that kind of overlays to that. It is not common that you can take a sales org and do an ICP shift and succeed without significant investment.
Yeah, absolutely. So to help companies do a reality check, you mentioned usage data earlier, but what ways, you're in play, you've decided on the ICP, you're in play. what kind of processes or KPIs or, what stopgaps do you see that would be best practices for companies to put in place to keep going back to, are we still on point? Are we still agreeing that this is the right ICP, or has our market shifted, for good reasons, probably because they're finding maybe some other archetypes who are finding benefit in their products. But how do you make sure that just in the fury of the day-to-day, fire drills that you go through, that there's kind of a process around reevaluating that on a regular basis? How do you like to do that?
I like to look at the ICPs on our businesses every 6 to 12 months or so. Any more than that, especially early stage, scale stage. So I'm talking generally your kind of 0 to 10, $15 million businesses. By the time you hit 10, 15 million, you should probably lock that in and not change it too often. But early stage, I would seriously evaluate your ICP probably every 6 months. So I mentioned usage. I genuinely believe that usage metrics are one of the most underutilized tools in that evaluation. So who's using your product? I think that there is a lot of value in overlaying usage data and upsell data. Who is using and paying more for the product? Those two things together. Who is not using it all? And those accounts are going to churn. You just haven't churned them yet, but they're going to churn. So kind of figure out what's the difference between those. I do think that part of that is you do a sample of your deals in the last 6 months and you do win reviews and loss reviews. And I think that the win reviews and the loss reviews need to be done as part of the ICP conversation, which is not just sales. Most companies do postmortems on deals, but they'll limit it to the sales team who worked the deal often, or maybe folks go to it. And it's not part of the marketing conversation. It's not part of the product conversation. You're not going to pull those people into every deal review, but I would recommend do a win and loss review on your top deals as part of your ICP evaluation. Like I said, every 6 months or so. And then I'm a big fan of the analyst community, at least in my market space, because in early stage, like I said, you end up talking to a lot of friends and family and connections, and you can sometimes hear from a smaller segment than you'd like. I really like checking in with the Forresters and Gartners of the world, and people like that are really helpful if you work in the enterprise B2B business as well, to ask them. You have to ask the right questions, but to ask them, is anyone asking you about this? So like I will often ask, are you getting inquiries for this type of stuff? Is anyone asking this? Does anybody care? And you have to be really open to the possibility that no one cares about the thing you're doing. Take that as an indicator. So that's one of the other things that I look for. And like, do people feel the need? Do people have the problem you're trying to solve? Anything you can get that's kind of independent data on, not just are people talking to you about it, but are, like in my world, are CISOs calling Gartner and asking about this, or, are people, there's search analytics data, like internet search analytics data from Google, you can get that type of stuff. But looking at, are people kind of looking for a solution to your problem, is another independent validation that I look for.
Yeah. What do you also think about trying to get access to those who aren't using your product? So e.g., are using a competitor's or the substitute, right? An alternative to that. And then second part of that is, this all sounds good, Emily, but how do you find these people? So to your point, I think just to repeat that, what you're saying is you're using the analyst as a proxy for having those conversations, because it's all flooding them. If the analysts aren't maybe tapping into those things, have you found other ways of being able to identify, some of these people, these personas, these archetypes in which you can start to get this insight from? Again, especially maybe if they're using other types of products that would be substitutes for what you're trying to sell.
Yeah. I made a comment earlier about, if you don't have people in your company working at your company who have lived the life of your ICP, go hire some of them right now. I will say that again, because if you are having a hard time talking to people who match your ICP, you're going to have a really hard time selling your product. mean,
Yeah.
that sounds so simplistic, but it's true. If you can't figure it out, guess what? You're going to have a hard time getting to them to sell to them. So one of the reasons that I believe that it is important to recruit your first handful of happy customers, if you can, or recruit people that work at them, recruit people who match your ICP and aren't using your product, is they also will come with networks of people in that industry who do that thing, who maybe are not using your product.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you recruit, Kathleen, the auditor from KPMG, who's been using your auditing software, guess what? She's got a bunch of other friends who are auditors. She's going to be able to connect you to them or introduce you to them for feedback. And that's different than the friends and family of the founders type connections. The friends and family of the people who work in your company that are your ICP is a different level. So yeah, some of it goes back to my advice on you got to hire people who actually match your ICP. Use those connections.
Yep, absolutely. For that sense of time here, I just want to summarize, Emily, you've given so many great nuggets here, but some of the takeaways that I was noting as we were talking is really understanding that your ICP is an archetype. It's not a market. More specific is good and is better. And that's how you should be defining those, making sure that your ICP is A, desire, B, budget, and C, product fit, unique product fit. Making sure to leverage your usage data to get support, your analysts, and being able to hire the right people so that you can get into that network so that you can have past your immediate kind of your first friends and family, an extended group of people who you can start to really understand their pains and kind of their day-to-day and soliciting feedback. We also talked about making sure to keep revisiting in those early stages. Every 6 months you had recommended on a regular basis and looking at the information, looking at your win and loss reviews. And again, being as a former sales leader, those are those things that we all know are great to do, but we don't do well. It's easily forgotten, right? Unless we kind of put a stopgap and say, hey, every quarter, this is win-loss review day, that we're going to dedicate to that. So I really like that point. And then obviously being able to use the community. So those are kind of the things that I've added. Any last one or two words of wisdom for those who are embarking on this, let's say, an ICP definition project now that you just want to either punctuate again or add to the list?
I think my main advice to anyone throughout the scaling experience on any aspect of it, ICP included, is there's a 0% chance you're going to get it 100% right the first time. Just know that and accept that. And look at the entire thing as a process and an evolution. And if you're not asking yourself, is this right, is the wrong question. Continually asking yourself, okay, what part of this is wrong? Because something's wrong. So where was I wrong? Is the way to look at it every 6 months when you do that review. It's not a question of, is this still right? It's a question of, no one's perfect. Something we missed. What did we miss, guys? And just look at it that way. Just accept the fact that some part of it's going to be wrong. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Yeah. Keep iterating through it. It'll get better every time and it'll grow your business as you do.
Absolutely. I like that. You always have a positive spin to things. And so, failing is not failing, right? It's informing the right answer later. So, okay. So just to do a little bit of something for fun. And again, I know you really well, Emily, but I want our listeners to get to know you. So we're going to do a thing of rapid fire. So I'm going to ask a question, quickly answer. What is your top number one favorite thing to do for fun if you've got a free Saturday afternoon?
Mountain biking. I'm a total adrenaline junkie.
What is the best part of your job?
Watching my team's just crazy ideas become real products. It feels like magic every time. I never think it's going to happen. It does. And I'm in awe every time it does.
What is the number one thing that you're most proud of in your life?
I am a mentor with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I have been for years, and I love it. It is my source of fulfillment.
What do you think was a critical turning point in you, coming to be the person that you are today? That's a big one, I know.
Okay. I worked for a startup that just failed. We had to do an asset sale and it sucked. And I think that's kind of everybody's worst nightmare. It's not just losing their job, but their company shutting down. It was the best experience in my life because it formed me to that idea of failure is not final, and you can work really hard and sometimes still fail, and that's okay. And you're still like, your family still loves you. You're still a valuable person. Don't take your job too seriously. I love what I do and I work really hard, but like at the end of the day, I'm also very much at peace with, you just can't you can't worry too much about it or it holds you back. And so working at a company that basically shuttered was like the best thing that ever happened to my career, because it just relieved all pressure from me in the future in a way.
I love that. Quick aside, I remember as we were talking about that, and what you really resonated with me as something I read about in Stoicism is really changing your perspective, because what I took away from that is really, what was all the learnings and where did that get to you that got you a multitude of different things that now you carry with you and you're in a better place for that. So at the end of the day, perception is everything. It wasn't a failure because you actually had all these personal gains come through that experience in terms of your networks and your contacts and all kinds of things. And so I love that you shared that, because that was one of the most meaningful conversations I think we had. I remember that distinctly. So, okay, going back to rapid fire. Give me 3 adjectives of what 12-year-old Emily Shipman was like.
Loud, quirky, and confident.
Loud, quirky, and confident. I like that. That sounds pretty consistent. 12-year-old Emily is still there. Favorite ice cream flavor?
Ooh, pistachio all day.
If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, only one, what would that be?
I am like a child and I love just straight up plain pepperoni pizza. Like, I can't believe anyone ever grows out of that. Anyone who puts veggies on pizza is lying to look horrible. It's just straight plain pepperoni pizza, so good.
Oh my God. If you could be one person in the world, who would it be and why?
Man. My favorite author is Alice Walker. I've read like everything she's ever written. I think she's so wise. She's had so many incredible experiences in her life, and I would absolutely love to sit down with her.
Love that. Okay. Last one. Your favorite holiday and why?
I love Thanksgiving, which is not normal. Well, I just like the food is great. I like Thanksgiving because there's not, even though there's cooking, there's not that much pressure and stress. Like, there's not the decorating, the shopping that Christmas has, or the like Halloween costume planning that goes into Halloween. I'm a pretty good cook and like I can throw a meal together. So I really enjoy a holiday where I don't really have to put that much prep into it, and then I just get to eat and hang out with my family. And I like football. Good football day.
I will tell you, I don't actually love the spread that comes with Thanksgiving. Like, I don't like the turkey. I don't like
veggies on pizza.
Right. And comma, I like the cauliflower pizza, right? The one that most people think is cardboard. I actually think that's delicious. So you're right. We are totally on different pages with food, type of thing. But funny story about holidays. My least favorite holiday is Halloween. And my daughter, her predicted date of birth was going to be November 4th. And I was just like, over my dead body, is she coming on Halloween? Like, I could just see what all this is going to look like in college. And I tried eating like some mysterious lasagna from an Atlanta restaurant that's going to make the baby come out at a certain point. And then, of course, when is she born? 1:30 a.m. on Halloween, so now I have a whole life of dealing with that. So anyways, Emily, it's always great to catch up with you. So we're going to do this soon enough, but I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with our listeners. I know this is going to be a very popular podcast. And so for all those listeners, so just a quick reminder, if you've got comments, follow-up questions for me, you can connect with me. Obviously, come hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm guessing, I'm going to put this out there, Emily, that she's open to it as well. So if you have those fresh on top of mind, we love feedback. I love to hear your thoughts, and maybe also if this spurred some other ideas of some other topics that we might do a double click on this ICP discussion, definitely keep that coming. If you like this, make sure to like the podcast and also to forward them to your friends and family. And a shameless plug for our next episode, which is specifically going to be something near and dear to my heart. Like Emily, I actually started my career on the software side as a sales engineer. And so the art and science of the demo. And Emily and I have some war stories from back in the day of how we used to be in that. So we're going to get through that with our friend Suzanne Brower, who leads global pre-sales at Archer, on our next episode. So hopefully you'll tune into that. So thank you guys for joining us today. Thank you, Emily. It's always fun, and we'll talk to you soon.